Cruz, welcome. Welcome to our state. Welcome to our capital city and flagship university. We appreciate you taking time to come here to the University of South Carolina. First, I'd like to thank the University of South Carolina for providing what I believe is a beautiful alumni center. We appreciate you being here. Senator, I know you heard my opening remarks, and so what I would like to do is just give you a quick moment to introduce yourself and your family. I know that you have here on the front row, and we're going to jump right into this.
Well, Alan, thank you. It's great to be with you. Thank you all for coming out, particularly on a rainy Friday afternoon. I appreciate y'all being here. I want to start by doing just what Alan suggested, introducing the love of my life, my wife, Heidi. And our two little girls, Caroline and Catherine. We're having an amazing time campaigning across South Carolina, all across the country. I'll tell you, the girls are doing an amazing job. Usually when we're on the bus, they're banging off the walls, they're having fun, they're swinging, they're speaking their heart. Catherine, the 5-year-old, made it through more than half of the debate last night before she went to sleep. Which I would say is better than most of the people watching at home. And maybe even some of the candidates. And let me tell you, I am so encouraged by what's happening. People are waking up. Listen, every one of us understands the urgency of what we're facing. We're bankrupting our kids and grandkids. We're seeing the federal government violating our constitutional rights each and every day. And America has receded from leadership. The image yesterday all of us saw in the newspapers of 10 American sailors on their knees. It was disgusting. It was heartbreaking. That image, if one image captures the failures of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy, that image makes everybody know. And the response, I got to say, to see President Obama and John Kerry groveling and apologizing to Khamenei as he's trying to embarrass and humiliate our sailors, that was even more disgusting. To see this president saying, "I'm so sorry," and then trying to send these theocratic tyrants $150 billion to be used to develop weapons to try to kill us. It is the height of lunacy. But the word of encouragement I'll give y'all, the worse it gets, the more people wake up. There is a direct connection. Sometimes things have to get really bad to startle people out of their slumber. And I am convinced 2016 will be an election like 1980. I'm encouraged by each and every one of you. I'm encouraged by the grassroots tidal wave that is sweeping South Carolina and sweeping this country, because I think people are waking up, they are rising up, and we're going to turn this country around. You know, we watched the State of the Union address. Well, somebody did. That I really think was less a State of the Union and more a state of denial. I mean, it was Obama saying things are hunky-dory, the economy's doing great, which if you're a big government lobbyist in Washington, is right. This is the time of fat and happy, but for working men and women in this country, enough is enough. And when he talks about how strong America is, while our sailors are held captive, doesn't so much as mention. Here's the silver lining. This week was the last State of the Union address Barack Obama.
Jump right into the meat of it. You heard me in my opening remarks to our group here today. We're going to talk about the Supreme Court because that's extremely important. It doesn't get enough attention on these debates. state stages. You all heard what I said about the statistics, the ages of members of the Supreme Court, that the next president could have a huge impact on the appointment process for the court for a generation or longer to come. Senator, having worked in the Supreme Court, been a law clerk for Chief Justice William Rehnquist, you have personal first-hand knowledge of how that place works over there. What are questions, what would you want to know from potential nominees to the court before you would even submit their names to the U.S. Senate?
Well, you know, Alan, you and I have both spent our lives fighting to defend the Constitution, fighting to defend the Bill of Rights. And we have right now today an activist, out-of-control Supreme Court. It is lawless. Last summer, within a period of 24 hours, they issued 2 decisions. On one day, a handful of unelected judges rewrote the text of Obamacare in order to force that failed law on millions of Americans. 24 hours later, 5 unelected judges purported to tear down the marriage laws of all 50 states, decreeing a right that is found nowhere in the Constitution. Both of those decisions were fundamentally illegitimate. They were lawless, they were wrong, and mark my words, they will not stand. Now, as bad as the current Supreme Court is, Alan is right that the next president, in all likelihood, will be a 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 Supreme Court justices. We are 1 justice away from a radical 5-justice liberal majority, the likes of which this country has never seen. Let me give some examples from the time when I was the Solicitor General of Texas. I spent 5.5 years as the chief lawyer for the state of Texas in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. When I was SG, we defended the 10 Commandments monument that stands on the state capitol grounds. We went all the way to the Supreme Court, and we won 5-4. We are 1 justice away from the Supreme Court ordering 10 Commandments monuments torn down in every courthouse, every state capitol, every public display across this country. 1 justice away is how close we are. When I was Solicitor General, we led 31 states before the Supreme Court in the Heller case, defending the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. We won 5-4. We're 1 justice away. It's something I talked about last night. The position of the 4 dissenters was not that some gun control is sometimes permissible. The position of the dissenters is that the Second Amendment protects no individual right whatsoever, that it is only a, quote, collective right of the militia, which is fancy lawyer talk for a non-existent right. Because what that means, 1 more justice, and the court will hold that not a single human being in this room has any right whatsoever under the Second Amendment, any individual right, which means the federal government or any state could make it a crime, a felony, for any American to own a firearm, and under the Supreme Court's radical interpretation that we're 1 justice away from, the Second Amendment would be written out of the Constitution, and not a single one of us would have any right in the courts to defend us. You know, when I was in private practice, I represented over 3 million veterans defending the Mojave Desert Veterans Memorial, a lone white Latin cross erected to honor the men and women who gave their lives in World War I. The lower court, the Court of Appeals, ordered that taken down. They said you can't gaze on the image of a cross on public land. We went to the Supreme Court. I represented 3 million veterans, and we won 5-4. We are 1 justice away from the Supreme Court concluding that no image of a cross, no religious symbol, no acknowledgement of God can be found in the public square, which will result in veterans' memorials being torn down all over this country, and we are inches away from coming in with chisels to remove the stars of David and the crosses on the tombs of our soldiers. That's how radical it is. This is front and center in the next election. And your question was, what question? The most important question I would ask is, will you be faithful? Will you follow the Constitution? And frankly, I don't care what they say. I care what they've done. I care if they've spent a lifetime standing and being faithful to the Constitution, walking the walk, the talk. Anyone can say that sitting in the interview room. We got to look, as the scriptures say, you shall know them by their fruits. We got to look to a proven record. And I give you my word from someone who spent his entire life fighting judicial activism, fighting to defend the Constitution. Every justice I put on the court will be faithful to the Constitution, will not embrace
executive action. Yeah, you know a little bit about that. As the State Attorney General, I have, like you, Senator, had to fight this administration with your former boss, Governor Greg Abbott, and many other AGs around the country. This administration, this president, frequently defy the Constitution, ignore Congress, and basically rule through administrative fiat, not through the rule of law. Last year, they tried to pass a law through an executive fiat action on basically changing immigration laws. And the state of Texas and South Carolina and 25 other states challenged it. We are currently winning that fight. A few years before that, South Carolina had paid more money into the nuclear waste fund. Every time you paid a utility bill, you paid money into a fund that paid for exploration at Yucca Mountain, which is a nuclear waste repository that numerous Congresses over 30 years, bipartisan, Republican and Democrat alike, had all agreed should be the place where we put it. The administration said, you know what? Y'all keep the nuclear waste. We'll keep the billions of dollars we've collected from you. Thank you. And the court said you can't do that. Just two examples. Senator, which executive actions of this president do you disagree with most, and why?
Well, I tell you, I pledged the very first thing I will do on the first day in office is rescind every single illegal and unconstitutional You know, in the previous Congress, I was the ranking member of the Constitution Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary. And in that capacity, we put out a whole series of reports on the lawlessness of Barack Obama and this administration. We chronicled 76 lawless acts. Sadly, that report's out of date. That was written a couple years ago. But 76 lawless acts from this administration, one after the other, ignoring the Constitution, ignoring the laws. You know, if you were to pick one, I think the one you highlighted, the President's executive amnesty. A couple of years ago, activists asked Barack Obama, said, will you grant amnesty by an executive? And the President said, I would like to, but I can't. I don't have the legal authority. Federal immigration law prohibits it. I don't have the constitutional authority. And he said, I am not an emperor. That's a quote from Barack Obama. I am not an emperor. Then just a few months later, partisan politics intruded, and guess what? He became an emperor. The exact same thing he said only an emperor could do, he turned around and said, we will ignore federal immigration law and decree amnesty. And you know who actually I think has put it best? There's a liberal constitutional law professor named Jonathan Turley. Now, Professor Turley is a man of the left. Professor Turley voted for Barack Obama in 2008. Jonathan Turley said, President Obama has become the embodiment of the imperial presence. Barack Obama has become the president Richard Nixon always wished he could be. That's an indictment from the left. Now, I will say one of the things that's unprecedented now is that the modern Democratic Party has acquiesced in this law. You look at the Senate Democrats, it is stunning that not a one of them, not a single one, can find the courage to stand up to a lawless president. I'll give you an example. The president, a couple of years ago, appointed several commissioners to the National Labor Relations Board. He did so using the recess appointment authority of the president, which applies only when the Senate's in recess. Here's the problem. The Senate wasn't in recess. And he just decreed, well, I say you're in recess. So I, as president, am going to say the Senate's in recess even when the Senate says we're not in recess. Now, look, this was brazen. There were 55 Democrats in the United States Senate. Do you know how many Democrats stood up to the president? 0. Look, there was an era not too long ago when you would have the old bulls of the Senate, the lions of the Senate. There would be the Mike Mansfield, there would be the Ted Kennedys, or the Robert Byrds, that would have taken on a Democrat in their own party, would have said, no president has the power to take the authority of the United States Senate under the Constitution. Not this Senate. You know, it went to the Supreme Court, 9-0. Said, of course, the president can't declare the Senate in recess when it ain't in recess. This was not a complicated or subtle thing, and yet today's Democrats, they use the ends justify the means. Well, we like the people he appointed, so we're happy with him just taking the Senate's confirmation power and ignoring it. That's going to change, and it's going to change on day one. The one silver lining. A week ago, he put out a bunch of lawless executive actions on guns, trying to go after the Second Amendment. Well, he may have a phone, or he may have a pen. But if you live by the pen, you die by it. And everything done with executive action can be undone with executive action, and I intend to do exactly that if I'm elected.
I'm using the metaphor of an emperor, and I can't help but think of that book. The Emperor Has No Clothes.
I gotta say, that's an image I'd really care not to see.
Metaphorically speaking, not literally. Immigration.
You told me this would be G-rated.
Immigration is another hot topic. We talked about the president's executive amnesty order last year that we're currently challenging. There are 27 states currently involved in that. Senator, what would you do to solve the immigration problem in the United States?
Well, look, immigration is a serious problem, and it's become all the more serious as we've seen the rise of radical Islamic terrorists. Border security is national. Anyone who's not prepared to secure the border and keep this country safe cannot protect the men and women of this country. I have laid out a very, very detailed immigration plan. It's 11 pages, single-spaced. Chapter and verse, exactly what I intend to do on immigration. This plan was drafted hand-in-hand with Senator Jeff Sessions and Congressman Steve King, probably the two strongest advocates and warriors in the United States Congress for securing this country, stopping amnesty, and keeping the country safe. What would I do? We're going to build a wall. You know, existing federal law requires 700 miles of reinforced fencing. You know how much Barack Obama's allowed to be built? 36 miles. They're just ignoring federal law. That's the existing law. He will not comply. We will build the wall. We will triple the Border Patrol. Because, look, I represent Texas. We've got 1,200 miles of border. When you ask law enforcement there what matters, the number one thing they say is boots on the ground. The most effective tool to actually secure the border. We will triple the Border Patrol. We'll increase fourfold the fixed wing and rotary wing aircraft, monitoring the border so when you see an attempted incursion, the boots on the ground go right to that spot and stop. We'll put in place a strong E-Verify system at the workplace so you cannot get a job without proving you are here legally. We will put in place a biometric exit-entry system on visas. You know, a lot of people don't know. 40% of illegal immigration doesn't occur across the border. People who come legally on visas and they just don't leave. Once again, existing federal law requires a biometric exit-entry system. Obama refuses to do it. I will comply with law. We'll put that in place so that the instant you overstay your visa, we know to the minute. We will end sanctuary cities. And you know, talk's cheap on that, but there's a real easy way to do it. There are 360 jurisdictions in this country that have declared themselves sanctuary jurisdictions. Every one of them is going to find their federal taxpayer money cut off. We will pass case law, and we will end welfare benefits for guaranteed relief. And the point that is important to understand, the media tells us all the time, we can't fix this problem. It can't be solved. What utter nonsense. You don't think a wall works? Go visit Israel. They put in a wall, and they're keeping terrorists out, and they ain't getting in. We know how to fix this problem. Most of the tools needed to do it are in existing law right now. Congress doesn't need to do another thing. What is missing is the political will. The Democrats and far too many Republicans don't want to get it done. And I'll tell you this, I give you my word. If I am elected president, we will secure the border, we will keep this country safe, and we will end illegal immigration.
So I see a lot of young people in the audience, Senator, and I see some very young, I see some college-age people. So this is kind of directed at you. We'll give you a quick lesson. And most everybody here knows this. There are 3 branches of government, right? The 3 branches are. That's like a highway lane. Each branch of government stays in their lane. The Constitution, each article says, executive branch, these are your powers. Legislative branch, these are your powers. Judicial branch, these are your powers. And then this is like an operating manual for how to run a republic. That's exactly what it is. And then the Constitution says, by the way, if the powers aren't listed in one of these 3 chapters, go to tab 10. We call it the 10th Amendment. It's back to the operating manual. Anything not listed in the Constitution is reserved to who? Right, the states. I have struggled as Attorney General with so many other AGs with federal bureaucrats running federal agencies who simply refuse to follow the law. They administrate, they rule through administrative fiat. The EPA, the NLRB, the DOJ, just name a few hot buttons. Senator, as president, how would you roll back those unelected bureaucrats who are entrenched in government and basically rule through regulatory fiat, and how would you get them out? How would you address that overreach?
So, Alan, let me quote the movie Jerry Maguire. You had me at 11. Look, if you look at the regulatory state, there is this unelected 4th branch of government, the bureaucrats, that outlast the politicians, that promulgate rules each and every day, that view themselves as the real governors of we, the subjects they believe. Now, if you look at what Barack Obama has done that is wrong with executive action, it is that he has intruded into the Article 1 authority of Congress, as you called it, the lane, where all legislative power is vested in the Congress of the United States. That means the president doesn't have the authority to make the law, to change the law, or ignore the law. But that being said, the president has robust authority in his lane. In Article 2, the executive power, all executive power is vested in one president of the United States. If you look at the regulatory state, that represents, over the years, Congress's efforts to intrude into the executive power of the president. Now, here's the sad reality. When Democrats are in office, regulations grow exponentially. When Republicans are in office, they still grow, just a little more slowly. Like a friend of mine suggested we should come up with a bumper sticker. Republicans, we waste less. I'm not exactly a banner marching in battle. Alan, we have never seen a president of the United States willing to use the full Article 2 executive authority of the presidency to take on the regulatory state, to fire regulators, to rescind regulations. The Waters of the United States rule. The Obama administration's put it in, trying to take the vast majority of the farmland and say it's all subject to federal regulation. They define a ditch or a puddle on your land as navigable waters. Now, to use another movie line, this time from The Princess Bride, you'll keep on using that word. I do not think it means what you think. As president, I'm playing all week. As president, I will rescind the waters of the United States. All right. And I will say there may be one government agency that I think should be expanded. Our embassy in Iceland. Because we may well need to transfer about 10,000 bureaucrats to the Iceland embassy. Which will clarify the minds for everybody else. And I give you my word, if I'm elected president, it will not be the case that regulations will continue to grow just more slowly, but rather, when I leave office, the body of federal regulations will be materially smaller, and human liberty will be an equal amount larger.
I think you just said is unlike most men in this room, he actually reads the instruction manual. You actually said, I don't know if you're peeking, but you started to answer another question I was about to ask. Waters of the U.S., we call it WOTUS, W-O-T-U-S, Waters of the U.S. The EPA's Clean Power Plan. These are issues that the EPA, I call it the Eliminate Prosperity Agency, because that's what it's doing. It's creating onerous regulations that are crippling, driving up the cost of energy and crippling business because of the regulatory actions that they're taking. I want to rename WOTUS to LOTUS, Lands of the U.S., because they're basically taking your land. It's another name for it. It's LOTUS. But my question for you is, how would you balance the need to protect a livable environment, because we all want a livable environment, with the reality of the cost of these regulations? Balance that.
Listen, everyone wants clean air and clean water. Last time I checked, we all breathe. Some people in Washington actually wonder about that. And we all drink water. Every one of us cares about being good stewards of the environment. But the reality is the Obama EPA has nothing to do with protecting it. These people are zealots. They are zealots who are anti-development. They hate anything that is developing, anything that is creating jobs, and we see activists that use these laws to target any new construction, any new development. And it's wrong. It is nuts. We need a president who will take on the EPA. You know, I'm reminded a few years back, the Obama administration was trying to use the presence of a little lizard out in West Texas to shut down oil and gas exploration. Now, my reaction to that is, you know the thing about lizards? They make darn fine boots. But you know, look, actually, endangered species are a great example. Where, you know what the worst thing that can happen to a species whose numbers are diminishing? Worst thing that can happen to them? They get listed as endangered species. Because what almost inevitably happens is you list them and their numbers keep going, because the incentive is if you see that darn lizard on your property, ain't no one looking. Because that little critter could take the value of your whole property. Now listen, I'd like to see endangered species replicate, but how about change the law and say if the species numbers are going down and you want to develop in its habitat, you have a safe harbor if you take that population and double or triple. Now, they don't have an obligation to crawl on that particular rock. You might move them to another rock. But how about you have the law create an incentive to increase the species rather than decrease the species and not shut down the development? That's actually valuing human beings. At least as much as you're valuing snails and fish. You can change the laws that we protect animals, and we in fact increase the population of animals by creating a positive economic incentive, but not doing it in a way that shuts down and hurts people. And to do that, the first step is going to be a president who is willing to take on the EPA and the zealots who are there and say either you enforce the law and stop going after and targeting and persecuting individual Americans, or you're out of a job. That may be the whole life of an industry.
We'll move to the next issue in the next 60 seconds, but I'd like to get your quick thoughts on the President's Clean Power Plan and his carbon tax proposal, real quick.
It is absolutely disastrous. It's the most costly regulation that has been proposed in modern history, and I'll tell you, there's a real test of a politician, what they're willing to say about global warming. You get an awful lot of politicians, an awful lot of Republicans that are scared to take this on. I would encourage y'all. So I chaired a hearing. I'm the chairman of the Science and Space Subcommittee of the Senate Commerce Committee. I chaired a hearing on global warming, brought in experts to testify on what the data show. I believe we should follow the science of the data. Now here's the simple facts. The satellite data demonstrate over the last 18 years there has been no significant warming whatsoever. Now that is, as Al Gore would describe it, an inconvenient truth. We chaired that hearing. I put up the satellite data there. I also put up John Kerry, had a quote, I think it was in 2009, he said, by 2013, the polar ice caps will be entirely melted. You know, the Bible talked about how you test a prophet. It said if someone comes and claims a prophet, you demand of them make a short-term prophecy, and let's see if it comes true. Well, 2013 came and passed, and anyone who's happened to visit the North or South Pole will notice there's a lot of ice up there. In fact, there is more polar ice today than there was in preceding years. It's grown, not diminished. Another inconvenient truth. We put up a picture. They sent an exploratory ship down to Antarctica. The people putting this trip together, they believed the computer models that said all the ice would be melted. So they just headed on down. I put up a picture. The ship got stuck in the ice because the ice has grown instead of melting. And you got to step back and understand what this debate is all about. You know, for those of us with some historical memory, you know, 20, 30, 40 years ago, there were a bunch of scientists, a bunch of liberal politicians talking about global cooling. They said we were headed to another ice age, and they said the answer was massive government control of the energy sector and every aspect of our lives. Well, then the evidence didn't support global cooling. It became pretty clear it wasn't cool. So then suddenly all of these same liberal politicians and the scientists making research money following the liberal politicians' theories, they transmogrified global cooling into global warming. And interestingly enough, their solution was the exact same. Massive government control for the economy, the energy sector, and every aspect of our life. But then the evidence didn't back it up. Their computer model said that it should be getting really hot, and the satellites that take the temperature didn't show it. So did y'all notice in the past couple of years, the theory has magically changed. Now it's climate change. And I gotta say, for a politician seeking a pseudoscientific theory to justify their power grab, climate change is perfect. You know, how many of y'all remember high school biology? The scientific method. You may be in high school biology. You start with a hypothesis, and then you test it with evidence. You try to disprove it with evidence. That's what a scientist is supposed to do. Climate change can never be disproved. Whether it gets hotter or colder, wetter or drier, the climate always changes. And so this is the perfect theory. And two final observations. One, their solution to climate change? Massive government control of the economy, the energy sector, and every aspect of our lives. You start to think maybe these politicians just want power and they don't care what bogus theory they're floating out the game. But secondly, what is the language of this debate? Anyone who questions their pieties gets named and branded a denier. Look, the word denier is not a scientific word. That's the language of religion. That's calling someone a heretic. And in my view, President's so-called Clean Power Act would drive up the energy bills, would cost tens of millions of jobs in this country, massively expensive. It's all about government power, and I'm not willing to tell a single mom in South Carolina who's struggling to put food on the table for her kids, I'm going to double your energy bill just to give Washington more power on a bogus theory that the science doesn't back.
That prompted me to talk about Obamacare. 2, 5, and 4 court decisions. We just talked about the courts, ladies and gentlemen. Remember that, how important judges are. Just go ahead. Here's the question. Obamacare. Question mark. You got it.
Take it out in the back alley, put 2 bullets in the back of his head. And let me give 2 more sentences. If I'm elected president, we will repeal every single word. And I'm going to talk about
make it short. Dodd Frank is to the financial industry what Obamacare is to the healthcare industry. It's centralizing power in the federal government to unelected bureaucrats. It makes getting capital for people on Main Street who want a student loan, a home loan, or a business loan more difficult. And it causes small banks to struggle against the enshrined power of the too big to fail banks. Senator, as president, what would you do to scale back Dodd Frank and help with these lines of credit to people on Main Street?
You know, I've joked before. Dodd Frank. Talk about a bill you don't got to read any further than the title to know nothing good can come from it. But Dodd Frank, remember, it's actually, Dodd Frank is a great example of what's wrong with money. It was sold to the American people as a way to stop too big to fail. How'd that work out? The big banks today under Dodd Frank are bigger. And who's getting hammered? It's the little banks. Alan, you're exactly right. It's the community banks. It's the small financial institutions, which, by the way, hammers all the small businesses. Have you noticed the giant New York banks don't make small business loans here in California? It's the community banks that fuel the small business loans that in turn fuel the job growth. Community banks are going under. And here's the point that's important to understand about it. That was not an unintended side effect. That wasn't, oops, we didn't realize that. The lobbyists for the giant banks were sitting at the table when the Democratic members of Congress were writing Dodd-Frank. And it's a real simple principle. When the giant companies put massive burdens and regulations on the industries, the big guys can absorb that. They've got so many accountants and lawyers, they throw a few more at them, it's fine, but what it does is it drives out of business their competition. And that's the intended purpose. My view is we should repeal every word of Dodd-Frank. And more broadly, Washington should not be used to help giant corporations, Wall Street. It shouldn't be in the business of cronyism and mandates and subsidies. We should get Washington out of the way, and if we're fighting for anyone, it should be the little guy, the small business, the job creators. That's how we turn our economy.
Several years ago, it was right after I became Attorney General, right after you were elected to the U.S. Senate, the National Labor Relations Board came to South Carolina and threatened to pick on a small startup company, very small airline company. South Carolina is one of the, actually it is the second least unionized state in the country. That's something I'm very proud of. I've never understood why you would have to compel someone to join an organization in order to have a job. If that organization is worth joining, you shouldn't have to compel them. They'll want to join. But I would like to have your general views on unions and the roles that they play with NLRB and how they affect business decisions to expand operations overseas.
Look, if you look at union bosses right now, they are destroying jobs in states across this country. I'm a passionate advocate of right to work. I think every American deserves the right to work without being forced to pay union dues, without being forced to join a union. If you want to join a union, that's fine, but that shouldn't be the condition to get the job. And I think we are on firm ground, standing and fighting for the American worker, fighting for your right to keep the money you earn in your paycheck instead of having union bosses use it to fund their political agendas and their power. I also think there's an incredible political opportunity. You know, Democrats have chosen between two traditional favorite children of the Democratic Party. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Harry Reid have made the choice to go with California environmentalist billionaires and their campaign contribution instead of the jobs of unions. And I think they've made a very cynical decision that the union bosses will round up the votes and they need the money. Now, I think that presents an enormous opportunity for Republicans to go to the union members all across the Midwest, the working men and women who are getting hammered, and say, we're fighting for you to have a job. You know, when you see the president kill the Keystone Pipeline for politics, just to appease the extreme, tens of thousands of high-paying jobs that with a stroke of a pen, President Obama says, go away. When you see that radical position, I think we have an opportunity. How do we win the general election in 2016? I think we fight for hard-working men and women across this country who want to believe again in the promise of this country, and we run against the bipartisan corruption of Washington. Which nobody embodies more than Hillary Clinton.
You touched on this earlier in your comments, but I have to talk briefly at least about the Second Amendment. We're a state, I don't know about y'all, but I like to cling to my God and my guns. I don't know how you get it. We have the actions of some mentally ill people, some deranged lunatics, and some people who are just outright evil. And they commit heinous acts, horrible acts, acts that would make any one of us cry. So they made the president cry. They made me cry. Seriously. But then these acts were caused because rules and laws weren't followed that were already on the books. And the mental health issue hasn't been raised enough. But just real quick, in 60 seconds, I would like to know your views on the Second Amendment broadly in the context of what I just said.
Well, let me give you a broader context, which is all of us are frustrated because we have candidates that talk a great deal of trade, and then they don't do what they say. You know, if you go to any candidate's website, there's always an issues page. They have a series of issues, A, B, C, D, and E. And they all say word for word the same thing. Every Republican says the same thing. On the Second Amendment, there is a right answer. I support the Second Amendment. Unless you are clinically insane, that's the right answer. Now, if you go to my website, which is tedcruz.org, one of the first things people know is we don't have to we have a page that is labeled a proven record. And it says, for far too long, politicians have said one thing and done another. Every one of us should ask any candidate who shows up in front of you, you say you believe these principles. Show me. When have you stood for them? When have you bled for them? And what have you accomplished? As the scriptures say, you shall know them by their fruits. And what it then says is, for the past decade, Ted has been fighting for conservative principles over and over again and winning on a national level. Cold. It goes through 3 pages of the book. Now, in the Second Amendment, everyone says they support the Second Amendment, including a bunch of folks on that stage last night whose record is going against the Second Amendment, but all of them say now they support it too. My webpage actually doesn't say I support the Second Amendment. It doesn't say a word about what is buried in the hidden recesses of my heart. What it does say is that as the Solicitor General of Texas, I led a coalition of 31 states before the U.S. Supreme Court defending the individual right to keep and bear arms, and we won a landmark 5-4 victory upholding that fundamental right. And then it links to the 2010 Carter Knight Freedom Fund Award given by the NRA every year to one of the leading defenders of the Second Amendment in the country. And then it links to the endorsement in the presidential race of Gun Owners of America, who said, we've looked, and every one of these candidates, all of whom talk about the Second Amendment, and the person with the strongest record is Ted.
About 10 more minutes. Real quick, I'm looking around the room, and I see a law enforcement officer back here in the corner, ladies. I see 2 other law enforcement officers back here. I don't know if we have any
Are they coming to get
ununiformed law enforcement officers or retired law enforcement, but this question's for you. As a chief prosecutor, this is one of the most important things I do is keeping our community safe. I know that the president doesn't have a direct role in local law enforcement, or even a direct role in federal law enforcement, although he has a lot of appointed power and authority in federal agencies. But we've all seen the President's Spear Summit. We've all seen a lot of these horrible things happening around the country, and then the riots that ensue because of one bad actor in law enforcement. But it makes me upset, ladies and gentlemen, when I see men and women who thousands and thousands of times a day interact with the public, and they do it right. One person doesn't do it right, and that's all it gets talked about. I think there's a role for the president to play. I don't know how you feel, but I think there's a role for the president and how they can increase public confidence in law enforcement. As the president of the United States, what would you do to increase public confidence for our law enforcement throughout the country who spend every day risking their lives to protect us?
Look, Alan, you are exactly right. I've spent a lot of years in my adult life working in law enforcement, working with officers, working with prosecutors to lock up and punish murderers and rapists and the very worst criminals we have. And one of the most shameful aspects of the Obama presidency has been the vilification and demonization of law enforcement. It started, as you noted, just in the opening months of the presidency with the beer summit that began, you'll recall, with the president saying that the law enforcement, the police officer in Cambridge, was foolish because he dared disagree with a Harvard professor. By the way, have you gone to Harvard Law School? You're almost always right disagreeing with a Harvard professor. Knowing nothing else. But it escalated from there. It escalated every time there was an incident. President Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder, Attorney General Loretta Lynch stood with the looters and rioters and criminals instead of the men and women of law. And I think maybe the saddest moment was when President Obama nominated to a senior position in the Justice Department a lawyer who had represented for free a cop killer, someone who had murdered a police officer, and this lawyer represented him for free and lionized him as some sort of hero for shooting cops. And I helped lead the opposition against that appointment. You want to talk about an insult to every law enforcement officer in this country when the lawyer who works for free for cop killers is going to become the head of the Civil Rights Division at the Obama Justice Department. And that nomination was so extreme that even in the Harry Reid Democratic Senate, we voted that nomination down because even the Democrats couldn't stomach what Barack Obama was. And as I traveled the country in the course of this political campaign, I had the opportunity to visit with law enforcement officers over and over again, whether cops, whether firefighters or first responders. And what I tell them over and over again is this vilification, this demonization, it will end on January 20th, 2017.
Senator, this question isn't on the paper, but I'm going to ask this quick question, and then I'm going to ask the final question and let you give your final remark. But this question is important to me because I have a number of pastors from various churches around the country, or around the state rather, tell me that they're concerned. These are men and women who want to follow the law, and they don't want to treat anyone poorly or badly. They want to respect everyone, regardless of who they are, how they worship, how they live their lives. But they don't want to be compelled to violate their own religious convictions, and the churches don't want to lose their tax exemption because of the Supreme Court ruling. As it relates to religious liberty, how would you protect it as President of the United States, while balancing it against the respect that people want to be treated with?
This is an incredibly important question. And I mentioned that I was going to rescind every legal executive order on the first day. I've also pledged. I pledged to do 5 things on the first day. Rescind every single illegal executive order. Direct the Department of Justice to open an investigation into Planned Parenthood. Direct the Department of Justice and the IRS and every federal agency that the persecution of religious liberty ends today. Rip to shreds this catastrophic Iranian nuclear deal. And begin the process of moving the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. liberty, this has been a lifelong passion for me. My father was a pastor. I have spent many, many years fighting to defend religious liberty and winning over and over and over again. And the assaults on religious liberty that are coming from Washington are unprecedented, and they keep getting worse. You know, with the gay marriage decision, the most chilling exchange was an exchange where Justice Alito asked the Obama Solicitor General, if your administration prevails, if this court purports to tear down the marriage laws of all 50 states, is the next step for the Obama IRS to come after Christian colleges and universities that follow a biblical teaching of the marriage of one man and one woman? And I would note, by the way, by extension, that applies to Christian grade schools, to charities, and even to churches. And the answer from the Obama Justice Department in an open court of the Supreme Court of the United States was yes. Yes, that is a very real possibility. This threat is real, and it's becoming real to more and more of us directly. One of the things we've been doing is we have organized religious liberty rallies. We did one in Iowa with 2,500 people. We did one here in South Carolina with 3,000 people at Bob Jones University. And what we endeavor to do in both of those, the media belittles these threats. They say they don't exist, they're made up. So we brought in heroes, people who have stood for their faith and been persecuted, and just had them tell their story. Now, typically at a political event, the candidate is front and center. I very deliberately wanted to recede from these events. I sat in the audience and just listened to these stories, and they're uplifting. For anyone who wants to see them, they're on our website, tedcruz.org. You can see people, ordinary people, a florist, a baker, a t-shirt maker, a fireman, people who stood for their faith and were persecuted. I'll give you one example. Chief Kelvin Cochran, African-American, grew up inner city, hard family circumstances. His whole life he wanted to be a fireman. And he achieved his dream. He became a fireman. He rose to become the chief of the fire department in the city of Atlanta. Then he was appointed by Barack Obama to a National Fire Safety Board, moved to Washington, served in the Obama administration, and then he went back to Atlanta to resume his role as chief of the fire department. Now, Chief Cochran is also a Sunday school teacher. And he was teaching in Sunday school, and he was focusing on the portion of the book of Genesis where God asks Adam and Eve, who told you you were naked? And he began thinking about really studying nakedness. What does it mean in the Bible to be naked? Not just in the obvious sense of not wearing any clothes, but in the broader sense of being outside of God's covenant, outside of His grace, outside of His righteousness, outside of the path. And he contrasted that with how the Bible used clothed in righteousness, clothed in grace. And he developed a whole set of teachings in his Sunday school based on that. And he decided to write a little book entitled, Who Told You You Were Naked? Now, in the course of that book, there's a page and a half that discusses what the Bible says about human sexuality. For writing a book about what he was teaching in Sunday school, in his private time, Chief Cochran was fired from his job as chief of the fire department. The position of the mayor of Atlanta is a Bible-believing Christian who actually believes what's in the Word of God is unfit to serve in public office. We heard person after person after person who told stories. It was powerful, it was moving. I'd encourage you to watch it online because it will be uplifting. People standing up in the face of persecution. This has been a passion of mine my entire life. And instead of having a federal government targeting our religious liberty, violating our religious liberty, we need a federal government that fights to defend the Bill of Rights of each and every American.
Should give me the wave, which means I need to wrap it up. But I want to wrap up with the final question. I identified our law enforcement at the back of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, the next question is personal to me. Senator, I'm going to let you end on this question and then shake hands. If you can do your closing statement with the question in it. I'm a veteran. I'm 19 years in the Army National Guard, served a tour in Iraq. I've got 3 brothers that served. Dad is a 31-year retired veteran. And many of you out here are veterans. In fact, no, don't clap to me. Don't clap to me, please, because I want you to clap to this for yourselves. If you are a veteran, or currently serving, have ever served in the military, if you are married to a veteran or someone who's currently serving, or if you have someone that you care about who is serving in the armed forces, I want you to stand up and clap. The reason that I did that is because I wanted to just see how pro-military this state is and this room is. And so this is a softball question, I admit it, but we want to know, veterans out there and people who care about veterans want to know, as president, for far too long many veterans feel that they've been neglected or not taken care of. As president, what efforts would you take to assist our military men and women and veterans alike?
Yeah.
And then you can close after that.
Look, Alan, that is a very, very important question. If you look at the last 7 years, what we've done to the military, what we've done to the veterans, has been disgraceful. We have dramatically reduced the readiness of this country. You know, in 1991, beginning of the Persian Gulf War, and by the way, tomorrow is the 25th anniversary of the beginning of Operation Desert Storm. We had about 8,000 planes in the Air Force. Today we have about 4,000. In 1991, we had over 500 ships. Today we've got 279. Our Army has a third fewer soldiers today than we had in 1991. And we have a commander-in-chief who has abandoned the fighting men and women of this country. He refuses even to say the words radical Islamic terrorism to identify our enemy. He sends them in to fight with rules of engagement that has both arms tied behind their back. They cannot win and they cannot keep themselves safe. It is shameful and it is disgraceful. And it's dangerous. The world gets more and more dangerous. He's sending $150 billion to the Ayatollah Khamenei, who is responsible for the murder of hundreds of American servicemen. People are fed up with it. By the way, if you want a stunning indictment, I would encourage you to Google it. W meets the Marines. W spelled D-U-D-Y-A. It shows George W. Bush in Iraq meeting with a group of Marines. They go crazy. I mean, they're screaming and yelling and cheering. They're so happy their commander-in-chief is with them. It's an amazing video. And then it cuts to Barry meets the Marines. And you see President Obama walking into a group of Marines. Now, they're all standing at attention. They're very polite. But not a single one of them is clapping. There's one guy in a suit in the front clapping really loud. And the silence is as deafening an indictment as you can imagine. They're being respectful to the man who occupies that office, but there is no mistaking the sentiments they have for a commander-in-chief who will not back up our fighting men. It is a disgrace. When it comes to our veterans, Hillary says it's no big deal that the VA is lying and keeping bogus books and denying life-saving treatment to our veterans. I think it's a national disgrace. And I can tell you there will be accountability. Anyone who has lied or broken the law will be fired or prosecuted. Most important reform in the VA is we are going to fight so that every veteran has the right to choose his or her doctor. And when it comes to our military, we have got to rebuild the military. We've got to rebuild the ships. We've got to rebuild the planes. We've got to get our troop strength back up to where we can defend this nation. We've got to get morale back up. We've got to modernize. We've got to modernize the nuclear triad. We've got to modernize our equipment. We've got to be prepared to win the war on radical Islamic terrorism. Model of how to do that. In 1981, Ronald Reagan came in after a similar hapless and ineffective president had screwed everything up. And what did Ronald Reagan did? He came in from the Jimmy Carter stagnation and he passed tax reform and regulatory reform. He reduced the burden on small businesses and job creators. And the incredible engine of the American free enterprise system took off, produced millions of high-paying jobs. That revenue, in turn, funded the ability to rebuild the military to defend this nation. And that, in turn, won the Cold War and bankrupted the Soviet Union. I intend to do the exact same thing. You know, President Obama a few months ago traveled to Europe. He told folks he doesn't believe in American leadership or America win. I got to say, FDR and JFK and Ronald Reagan were all spinning in their graves. And an American president saying that my view on radical Islamic terrorism, our strategy, to borrow a page from Ronald Reagan in the Cold War, should be very simple. We win, they lose. And there is no higher commitment that I will have as Commander-in-Chief than to stand with our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines, to have their back, to stand with them, never to put them in harm's way without rules of engagement that enable them to win and then bring our boys and girls home. And let me just make a final point, closing out. Thank you guys for being here. South Carolina plays a critical role in our primary process. Historically, South Carolina has selected presidents. Very often, Iowa chooses one candidate, New Hampshire chooses another. It comes down to South Carolina to make the critical decision. And I think the role of the men and women here across the state is to ensure that the next Republican nominee and the next president of the United States is a true and genuine and proven conservative. It's easy for candidates to say they're conservative, but have they walked the walk? Do they have a record? If a candidate says he's going to take on Washington, great. We ought to ask, when have you ever taken on Washington? When have you stood up? Who stood up, not just to Democrats, but to leaders in our own party? Each of you to do three things. Number one, commit today to come out and vote in the Republican primary and vote for us in the Republican primary so that we win the state of South Carolina. Number two, volunteer. Sign up today to be a precinct leader, a county leader. Sign up today to reach out and get others. Pick up the phone and call your mom. Call your sister. Call your mom is a good idea anyway. But call your sister, call your son, your next door neighbor, your business partner, your college roommate. Say, this election matters. For my future, for my kids, for my grandkids. I want to ask everyone here to vote for me 10 times.
Please don't. If not, I'll have to prosecute you.
Now look, Alan, we're not Democrats. I'm not suggesting voter fraud. But if every one of you finds 9 other people to go vote on primary day, you will have just voted 10 times. And the third and final thing I want to ask you to do is that you pray. That you lift up this country in prayer, that each day between now and election day, you spend just a minute each day. When you wake up in the morning, when you're shaving, when you're having lunch, when you're putting your kids down to sleep, when you're going to bed, spend 1 minute a day saying, Father God, please continue this awakening, the spirit of revival that is sweeping this country. Awaken the body of Christ that we might pull back from this abyss. if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear their prayers and will forgive their sins, and I will heal their land. A bit of history that our friends in the mainstream media will never tell us. In January 1981, when Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, his left hand was resting on 2 Chronicles 7:14. A very real manifestation of that promise from Scripture, and I tell you, we have done it before, we can do it again. If we stand together, we will win the primary, we will win the general, and we will turn around this country and restore this nation, this exceptional nation that every one of us loves so much.